let's continue with our lecture on public choice. And if we remember, public choice is also referred to as politics without the romance. And so when we look at politics, how it actually takes place in the real world, not this nirvana fallacy or nirvana notion of this sort of utopian idea of political decision making, what the tools of economics shows us is the political process can be viewed as a complex interaction among three different groups: politicians, bureaucrats, and of course voters or voters slash taxpayers. And we see three big insights from public choice, and we're going to start with the first one, this idea that politicians favor special interests. So hopefully you remember from our classes on gains from trade and international trade, even though trade is shown to be very wealth enhancing and wealth generating, it's very unpopular. And this is certainly true when we're talking about politicians and special interests. The American auto workers, they tend to have very strong union power. So they form these very powerful interest groups, and they have a strong incentive to go lobby and get help from politicians, especially in regards to restricting trade. So if you're an auto worker, you don't want to import foreign cars from Japan or Germany or any other country because it might put your job in jeopardy. And if you're an average Joe American consumer over on the right, you might not notice that small cost that's dispersed on you because it's dispersed across so many other people that also bought a car. And especially when you see the plight of the people on the left, you're going to forget, and politicians tend to kind of cash in on that, but special interest groups really push this. And if you remember, this is because of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, ooh ha ha. So American auto workers, for example, they're really going to protest and try to get help from political decision makers because they stand to lose a lot if something doesn't go their way, like free trade, allowing cheaper foreign cars to come in. And they know they might be able to get away with it, and politicians will know too, because they can disperse the costs over a large number of constituents. And you might not notice that cost, especially if it's really small relative to you, the individual, even though overall, for society, as we saw with our international trade graphs, society is probably going to be poorer if we implement trade protections like tariffs or quotas, for example. But because of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, ooh ha ha, politicians see that they themselves can benefit if they concentrate the benefits on their voting class and disperse the costs, ooh ha ha, on a large, relatively ignorant, as we'll discuss, voting base. So what is it that motivates political candidates and office holders? Well, is it the public interest or votes? Economics, and specifically public choice economics, indicates that their actions and political positions will be heavily affected by the pursuit of votes. Now, no doubt, many of these politicians and political decision makers genuinely care about the public interest, and the quality of government is important to them too. But they need to be elected to achieve their objectives, whatever those objectives may be. So clearly, politicians have a strong incentive to give voters a reason to support their candidacy. If a candidate's going to be successful, their positive attributes need to be brought to the attention of voters, and they usually focus on their families, their jobs, or other sort of civic duties and activities. They also bring up local advertisements with celebrities and sports teams, and those topics are probably more entertaining to voters than boring political speak. The successful candidate needs to spend money on a campaign, and they need to make that worthwhile. It's not unusual for even an incumbent candidate in the U.S. Senate to spend $15 million or more just seeking re-election. In other words, votes are the necessary objective of politicians. They're vote maximizers, and they need money and they need support to maximize those votes. And so they tend to get that support from special interest groups. Special interest groups pay for the policies that will concentrate the benefits on them and spread the cost widely, ooh ha ha. Thomas Sowell puts it this way: the first lesson of economics is scarcity. There's never enough of anything to fully satisfy all those who want it. But the first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics. We know that catering to these special interests might lead to policies that lead to deadweight loss in a way that is more costly to the overall economic pie than just having free markets. But politicians have an incentive to maximize votes, so they have an incentive to cater to special interests that will help get them those votes and get them into office. And special interests know this too. I mean, this is why lobbying is one of the most lucrative professions that somebody can have. I mean, in the United States alone, this is a million dollar industry, $100 million industry. Pharmaceuticals and healthcare products, probably the highest. Electronics, insurance, real estate, all the way down to things like TV, movies, and entertainment. I mean, individuals lobby and spend trying to capture favor from politicians in exchange for political support. And this leads to what's known as the special interest effect. And this is when an issue generates a large personal benefit for a small number of constituents while imposing a small individual cost on a large number of others, usually somewhat ignorant voters. So interest group members feel strongly about the issues that provide them with substantial personal benefits. And so these issues are going to dominate their political choices. So special interest groups, they have an incentive to stay informed, to lobby, and try to back politicians that are going to help them get those results that they want. Being informed is costly, but the benefit to these special interest groups is greater than that cost. So they can expend the costs on lobbying, for example, where you and me individually, we don't have much to gain. The typical voter doesn't have a lot to gain, or they really don't have a lot to lose, much from being informed and spending all this time lobbying. There's really only going to be a small impact on their personal welfare, but there'll be a large impact on the total economy's welfare. So typically, when a policy is very narrow in impact and difficult to understand, special interest groups get their way. That's the special interest effect. One example of this was the price supports and import quotas on foreign sugar. And these price supports caused the price of U.S. sugar to be 50 to 100% above the world level. I mean, there's only about 20,000 sugar growers in the United States of the 360 some million population in the U.S., and they get huge benefits. So there's an average benefit to each sugar grower of about $85,000. There's a small personal cost on U.S. households, so per household, the cost is about $25. So at the end of the year, if I told you that your income went down by $25, you probably wouldn't care that much, and you probably wouldn't even notice it. But if we think about it, $85,000 per grower for 20,000 sugar growers, that's $1.7 billion in concentrated benefits to those sugar growers. But the personal costs, well, if we do the math, it's actually $3.3 billion in dispersed costs. So the dispersed costs of $3.3 billion are greater than the $1.7 billion in concentrated benefits. That's a net loss for society, a huge net loss of over $1 billion. But individually, you're not going to notice, and you don't really have a strong incentive to go lobby to get rid of sugar price supports. In fact, you probably won't even know about them because you're going to just care about the plight of the sugar growers, and want to help out your fellow American citizen. I mean, the sugar lobby, they contributed more than $16 million to politicians during the most recent election cycle. Well, if you think about it, $16 million is nothing compared to the $1.7 billion in benefits that they would get. So this program continues, even though it is counterproductive. It's economically loss-inducing. So how is it that this keeps happening? What are the ways in which these economically inefficient policies keep getting through? Well, in Congress, special interest legislation can get through usually through what are known as log rolling or pork barrel legislation. So log rolling is the exchange between politicians of political support on one issue for political support on another. So I'll help you roll your log. If you help me roll mine, well, I'll vote for your bill if you vote for mine. So maybe with sugar, hey, will you help support my sugar quota bill, and I'll help support the bill that gets, something for your constituents? Or pork barrel legislation is when there's a package of spending projects that are bundled into one single bill. And this is usually when a project has a very intense benefit meant to go to a certain special interest group that would be unlikely to pass in its own bill. So usually what politicians do is they try to tack it on into other bills that they know are going to be a lot more likely to pass rather than trying to pass that bill itself. Special interest groups engage in what's known as rent seeking, and this is when there's actions by individuals and interest groups that are designed to restructure public policy in a manner that will either directly or indirectly redistribute more income to themselves. And usually this is done with widespread use of taxing and spending and other sorts of regulatory powers of government that can favor some at the expense of others. So this rent seeking is encouraged. I mean, if the government's involved in the granting of contracts, subsidies, tax credits, low interest loans, and any sort of other regulatory favor, well, firms, labor organizations, and any well-organized special interest group, they're going to compete for those government favors. They're going to rent seek. So they actually demand regulation. They demand regulation that will concentrate the benefits on them, but disperse the costs, on a large number of other voters. And so this demand for regulation, it can be satisfied by the supply offered by legislators and regulatory agencies. But the problem is rent seeking tends to divert resources away from productive activities. Instead of the typical profit seeking we see in the market, where you're providing some sort of value to someone who wants or needs it, rent seeking is diverting productive resources away. So the output of economies with substantial amounts of rent seeking, it usually falls below what's productively efficient or the productive potential. So that was politicians favoring special interests. Next up, we're going to look at the next key insight from public choice, and that is the size and incentives of big bureaucracy.